I want to begin this morning with a question, and I don't need you to answer out loud. I just want you to answer in your own head. I just want you to answer it in your own heart. But the question is this: what thoughts go through your mind when you see pictures like this? That top picture in the corner is one of the Andromeda galaxy. It's 2.5 million light years from Earth, from where we sit right now. And there was a time when, the best scientific minds in the world thought that the Andromeda galaxy was actually just a nebula. If you're not sure what a nebula is, it's just this gaseous cloud full of dust that is often thought of as the remnants of a dead star and the birthplace of new stars. And then we went and built a bigger telescope and realized, oh my word, this is an entire galaxy, and there are literally thousands and 10,000s of stars in what we formerly thought was just this nebulous cloud of dust. It's an amazing thing. The universe that we live in is unimaginably big. And then the other picture, very famous picture, it's the Earth from the moon, taken in 1968, year before I was born. That pale blue dot suspended in this vast darkness. And then I also had a picture of a humpback whale, and the humpback whale really just is meant to represent for us this morning the breadth of of creation in the world, right? Everywhere you look on planet Earth, you see life. There are literally billions and billions of dollars and multitudes of people that are giving their lives to try to find life somewhere out in the universe, and they always come up with nothing. And yet there's no place you can go on planet Earth where you do not see life. I remember a handful of years ago or so, NASA was testing a bunch of equipment in the waters under the polar ice caps. And the reason why they chose that particular location is because they wanted to find some environment that would simulate the really harsh conditions on Mars, and they were convinced that this was the one place on Earth where you would find no life, right? It was so hostile, life could not possibly exist. And so here are these pieces of equipment, and it's suspended under the polar ice caps in the waters there, and it's floating around, and of course it's got cameras, and it's videotaping everything, and this little Arctic shrimp just comes swimming in front of the camera, right? Just doing its thing, and it looks over, it's like, what's up, right? Because it's just, right? Everywhere you go on planet Earth, you find life. Whenever we look outside of planet Earth, we find no life. And then what goes through your mind when you see a picture of a newborn baby? No, this is not one of our 4 grandchildren. This is not my first rodeo. I would not pick one to put on the screen like that. Her name, though, is google.com/sleeping baby pic. I mean, that's her name. I know, weird, right? But what goes through your mind when you see a little baby sleeping like that, right? Because there was a time when that child did not exist. And then a man and a woman made their contributions, and then 9 months later, you've got a human being. A unique human being that has never existed before in the history of the world. What goes through your mind when you see these kinds of things? There are a number of options that might be legitimate possibilities. One of them might be you'd think to yourself, oh my word, isn't gravity awesome? That's the conclusion Stephen Hawking came to. 2010, he wrote a book called The Grand Design, and in it he postulated, by pulling together a number of theories, he postulated that you don't need God to explain the existence of the universe. Gravity alone explains how the universe could spontaneously create itself. It's a circular argument that doesn't pass the logic test, because essentially what he says is this: the universe requires gravity to exist. So because the universe exists, gravity must have also existed, therefore the universe exists. The reason why it fails the logic test is because the merry-go-round doesn't tell you how to get from point A to point B. The merry-go-round tells you how to get from point A to point A. Another option that might come to your mind is to say, oh my word, isn't Mother Nature so awesome? This uncaring, unidentifiable, unsympathetic, unthinking, unfeeling force, isn't this so amazing to create all that we see? Listen, not only can you not identify Mother Nature, but if that were a thing, she doesn't give a rip about you. The universe doesn't give a rip about you. Or maybe you'd think to yourself, oh my word, isn't God awesome? How amazing are his works. And this God who hung the stars and knows all of them by name, knows my name, and he cares about me. How you answer that question, what do you think when you see things like this, has incredible implications for our lives and our eternities. I start that way because this morning in Romans 1, beginning here in verse 18, the Apostle Paul is going to take a turn into the first major section of his master class on the gospel. And I would remind you that the word gospel means good news, but in order for the good news to be really good, it has to stand in contrast to bad news. And the bad news, as it turns out, is really bad because what Paul is going to do over the next essentially 3 chapters is lay out his argument for the universal, natural and deserved condemnation of all men. That includes you, and that includes me. So we've got a lot of work to do this morning. So I'm going to encourage you, strap in, right? Get your mind ready. I hope you have a pen, a piece of paper, or you take notes on an app on your phone, because I'm asking you to pay attention to what we need to do here, and we don't have a lot of time to do it. So let's get to work. Romans 1, beginning in verse 18, notice down to 23. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, having been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. I want you to notice Paul's logic here in this paragraph. He lays out a truth, and then he lays out the consequences for rejecting that truth. And the truth that he establishes in these verses is this: that God has revealed himself through the things that he has made, but instead of us as humanity acknowledging his existence and glorifying him and giving thanks to him as we were designed to do, we actually reject him, and we find for ourselves substitutes for him, and we make other gods in his place. And in order for us to do that, we have to hold down or suppress all the truth around us that declares that there is a God. And the consequence for that suppression of truth, Paul says, is wrath and increasing wrath, meaning God is angry with us, and he grows increasingly angry with us for every expression and every moment and every second of our unbelief. Failing to reject him and acknowledge him as the eternal, uncaused first cause of everything that exists. So now notice again verse 18. He says, for the wrath of God is revealed, it's made plain, from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness are suppressing this truth. He uses this word wrath, and wrath pictures both fury and punishment. And God's wrath is demonstrated in 2 ways, both passively and actively. The passive wrath of God can take, again, a number of forms. And one of the forms that the passive wrath of God takes is that mankind, because of our sin, our rational faculties do not function the way they're supposed to function. We don't think rightly about spiritual things. We don't think rightly about the nature of reality. It's called the noetic effect of sin. It doesn't have anything to do with Noah and the ark. It comes from a Greek word that speaks to the mind. Because we have given ourselves over to sin, we don't think about God, we don't think about ourselves, we don't think about the purpose of life the way that we ought to. And Paul speaks about that here in the latter verses of this paragraph, that we become futile and darkened in our understanding. That's part of the passive wrath of God against us. And the other form the passive wrath of God takes against us is the fact that he has created his universe because of our sin in such a way that it is impossible to find from the things that God has made, those things that we're only meant to find in him. So everybody's looking for happiness. Everybody's looking for joy. Everybody's looking for purpose. Everybody's looking for a sense of identity. Everybody's looking for some kind of security in a very uncertain world. And we naturally search for those things in creation. We naturally search for those things in the things that God has made rather than in God. And he structured his universe in such a way that it's impossible to find those things apart from God. So nothing in creation can ultimately satisfy your heart. It's impossible. And you know it. What is the only thing that happens when you give in to a craving? You just give birth to another craving. Every time you said to yourself, this is the last time I'm going to do this is the last time I'm going to look at this is the last time I'm going to inject this, it's the last time I'm going to smoke this, it's the last time I'm going to swallow this, I'm never going to do it again because this time will be the last time it will finally satisfy me. And how long does that last? About a minute and a half. And then you're right back there trying to scratch that itch. That's part of the passive wrath of God against us. He refuses to allow us to find what we're looking for in the things that he has made, but not in him. His active wrath is most clearly seen in the promise of eternal damnation, where all of his fury, all of his punishment is going to be unleashed upon us if we die in our natural state, will be unleashed upon all, he says, ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. Ungodliness is religious rebellion. Religion has been hardwired into humanity. We see it across every culture, every ethnicity, across all of human history. We are wired for religion. And the reality, though, is all of mankind's religious efforts to create the right ladder, to create the right system that will allow us to work off the wrongs that we do so that we might somehow attain to God and attain to heaven, attain to eternal life, attain to some state of spiritual perfection. They only add to our unrighteousness. All the things that we do to deal with our guilt only make us more guilty. And then the word unrighteousness here speaks to moral rebellion. That even in violation to our own conscience, when we know what the right is, we still choose to do the wrong. And Paul says there is coming a day that if we die in that state of unrighteousness, that God will pour out all that fury and all that punishment upon us, not simply in a moment in time, but forever and ever and ever, the endless moment. And the worst part of it all is that Paul actually says that this state of ungodliness and unrighteousness is the natural condition of every human being. It's the exalted autonomous self. It's that idea that says, I'm going to do what I want to do, and no one's going to rule over me. No one's going to tell me what to do. I am my own highest authority. So Paul's argument here in this paragraph is that you cannot deny the fact that there is a God. And the problem with that is our natural default state of existence is to say, you're right, Paul, there is a God, and he is me. And if you think I'm lying, just ask yourself, how do you respond when people break your law? How do you respond when people disappoint you? How do you respond when people don't measure up to your standards? You absolutely are willing to acknowledge a God as long as that God that you're acknowledging is you. And because of that belief, or in order to get to that belief, we have to suppress the truth of the living God that he has planted everywhere we look. From the microscope to the telescope to the very mirror you looked into this morning when you were getting ready, all of it declares that there is a God. And actually what the Bible says is in order to get there, we actually have to choose to play the fool. The book of Proverbs talks a lot about the fool and the difference between the fool and the wise, but the fool is never simply foolish. The fool in the Bible is always the one who chooses to play the fool. Against all the evidence that is available to them, they choose to ignore it. It's like, hey, don't you see the evidence of God when you look into the stars? You're like, I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you see the evidence of God when you look at the abundance of life on earth, but the absence of life everywhere else in the universe? I don't know what you're talking about, right? And we refuse to acknowledge it. We are playing the fool. Notice verse 29 and to 21. Paul says to us, for what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Paul in this text is referring to a theological concept known as general revelation. General revelation. This refers to all that can be known about God through creation. It's called general in part because it's available to all people everywhere, regardless of their language, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their cultural background, regardless of the era in which they have lived, because this information that can be known about God through creation has been available to mankind as long as there has been mankind. I want you to notice what the psalmist says, Psalm 19. Just the first 3 verses, though Psalm 19 is a wonderful psalm where the psalmist describes both books that God has written, because God has written 2 books. The first book is the book of creation, and then God has written his special revelation in the Word of God, and Psalm 19 exalts both of those books that God has written. But in the beginning, he begins with the first book of creation, and he says, the heavens declare the glory of God. The glory means weight. The heavens declare the weight and worth of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day, creation pours out speech, and night to night, creation reveals knowledge. There is no speech, there are no words whose voice is not heard. So every day, creation exists to declare and to shout to all of humanity, wherever it is that you live, whatever your background is, there is a God, there is a God, there is a God. And the fact he is awesome. He is creative. He reigns above us. I want to walk through, again, as quickly but as thoroughly as I can, just 3 kind of big buckets that I want to encourage you to think about in terms of evidence of God's existence. First one's going to be anthropology. The second is going to be cosmology, and the third is going to be biology. So anthropology is a study of man, cosmology is a study of the universe, and biology is a study of living things. And we'll begin with this big bucket of anthropology, the study of man. The Bible is very clear to say to us that God has written a moral law on every human heart. Paul's actually going to talk about that in Romans chapter 2. We're going to get there in 2-3 weeks or so. God has written a moral law on every person's heart, and your human experience declares that to be true. You know this is true. Just consider, you do not need to teach a child that it's wrong to steal. Just watch what happens when one child takes a toy away from another child. That child who just lost his toy will reveal the moral law written on his heart that what just happened, that's not right. And they'll reveal that fact that there's a law written on their heart that says stealing is wrong, because they will try to bite that child who took their toy. We have 4 grandchildren. 3 of them walk, talk, are very volitional, meaning they have desires and they're at a point in their life they can act on those desires. And then there's Atlas, he's just trying not to get run over by the other 3, right? And he kind of just, if he can hold his neck up, it's a good day, right? when they get together, they were together with us just a couple of weeks ago. You might have saw them running around here. When they're here, they kind of run around like they own the place. And so they were at our house, and there's these things called poppets. I never knew what a poppet was until we had grandchildren, but they come in all kinds of shapes, and they're just things that you push them down, and then when you turn it over, you push it back the other way. It's literally not more complicated than that. And there was a square one with these rows of little things that you pop from side to side, and it was multicolored, and they all wanted that one. Oh my word. After they all left, at the end of the weekend, they all went back home. Michelle was in the pantry, and she comes out, and she's holding a poppet, and she said, "Why was this poppet on the top shelf of the pantry?" I said, "I had to hide that thing. It was like World War III in here. They were trying to bite each other. They were trying to push each other. It was crazy." You don't have to teach human beings that stealing is wrong. Anyone who's ever been stolen from knows that's wrong. You don't have to teach human beings that cutting in line in front of other people is wrong. This afternoon, you want to do a social experiment? This is going to be really fun. This afternoon, you go to Walmart, right? And you get a regular size cart. You fill it over the top. You go to the self-checkout line with everybody who's like got a loaf of bread and a gallon of milk, and they've taken a mortgage out to get some eggs, right? You got your full cart. You just walk by all of them and go right to the first open self-checkout register and see how the people behind you react to you. My guess is they're not going to say something like, "That person must have an emergency. Their time must be certainly more valuable than mine. Why don't you please go ahead?" I'm guessing they're going to have a very negative response to what you. If you're going to do that this afternoon, could you please call me? I want to watch that. That'd be a lot of fun, right? Everybody knows that, right? Why? Because we're obsessed with what's fair. Again, our grandchildren are 5 and under. And it blows my mind when I hear them say, "That's not fair." How do you even know what fair is? And this is the problem with fairness. If fairness to the human heart only meant I want what everybody else has, maybe we could talk about some good aspects to that. But fairness to the human heart never means that. Fairness to the human heart means I want what everyone else has and just a little bit more. You don't have to teach children about shame when they're caught doing something wrong. Watch what they do when they break a rule and they're caught doing something wrong. They will run from you and they will bury their face in the couch because they believe that if they can't see you, you can't see them, and they are effectively hiding from you. Why do they want to hide from you? Because shame is that feeling of exposure, right? Shame is that recognition that someone sees me and they see me as a sinner. They see me as a rebel. They see me as someone who has broken the law. That's exactly what Adam and Eve did when they were first caught in their sin. The first emotion that swept over them was one of shame, and the result of that is they hid themselves from God in the garden. Listen, you might think that Genesis 1, 2, and 3 are somehow manufactured mythology to try to explain the realities that we see around us. I'm telling you, they're literal human history, and they explain everything about us. Adam and Eve ran and hid, and every 3-year-old will run and hide. And you are tempted to run and hide every time you are exposed and you fear that someone now sees me. You don't have to teach it. It's wired into us. Why is it that some of the first words every child ever learns is not necessarily mama and daddy? It's no and mine. 2-year-olds begin to build their kingdom. Mine, mine, mine. And they'll invite you to play with them, but what they mean by play with me is watch me play, but don't touch my stuff. We're like the mouse who living in the king's castle steals a crumb from his table only to run back to all the other mice and say, "Behold my crumb." We have this completely disproportional view of ourselves. And it causes us to write ourselves into the center of every story, to make everything about us, and to desire and to fight and claw to sit in a seat that is not ours to sit in. And again, you know this is true. Because how many good things have come from you trying to be your own God? So listen, if there is a moral law, there must be a moral lawgiver. Morality, listen, no matter what our evolutionist friends will have to say about it, morality cannot be the result of naturalistic evolutionary processes. The animal kingdom shows us what animalistic, naturalistic morality looks like. It's survival of the fittest. It's might makes right. So nobody watches National Geographic and sees the lion take down the gazelle and, get a good bite out of their neck and thinks, that's murder. We just think, Hakuna Matata. It's just the way nature is, right? What are you going to do about it? And yet if I jump off this stage and I tackle Pastor Andy to the ground and I take a big bite out of his neck, no one's going to think that's okay, right? No one's going to think maybe his blood sugar dropped and he's snackish, right? That's not what we're going to think. We're going to think that's wrong. Amen. Amen. That's exactly right. Why? Because there's a moral law written on our hearts. And if there's a moral law written on our hearts, there must be a moral law giver. Nature will not get us there. Second big bucket, and listen, we're just scratching the surface of these arguments, but the second big bucket I want to walk through is that of cosmology. And within science, there's a scientific principle called contingency. It's a very simple idea. It simply means this: if something begins to exist, its existence is dependent upon something outside of itself for its existence. Let me say it again, just in case you're taking notes. Contingency means this: if something begins to exist, its existence is dependent upon something outside of itself for its existence. And so that thing has to pre-exist it. And again, you, from your own experience, know this is true, right? Would you all agree with this statement? You exist. Unless you're having some kind of metaphysical crisis where you're questioning your own existence and whether, this is all real or we're just living in some kind of simulation, right? If that's the case, see me afterward. We have biblical counseling. We can help you, right? But you exist, and you acknowledge that you exist. But you didn't make you, right? There were people who pre-existed you who made you. So this idea of contingency is not complicated. We all understand this in a very simple and a very clear way. Likewise, very famous illustration, you can take all the pieces of a watch and you can stack them on top of each other. So you can have the band and you can have the clasp and you can have the gears and you can have the dial and you can have the jewels and so on that make everything work. You can stack them on top of each other and no matter how much time you give it, you will never get a fully functioning watch as a result of that. So again, very famous illustration, but if there's a watch, it is to be assumed there was a watchmaker. And so everybody recognizes that the universe came into existence at a moment in time, that there was a moment when the universe didn't exist, and then it came into existence. For the secularists among us, they call it the Big Bang. For those of you who would call yourself a Christian, you would look at Genesis chapter 1. Either way, there was a time when the universe did not exist, and now it does, and every physicist acknowledges that the universe that we live in was fine-tuned to exist. Absolutely created, down to the smallest detail, to exist. I've used this illustration a number of years ago, but I think it's one of the most convincing and compelling to me. I did not come to faith in Jesus Christ as a believing in divine creation. I was an evolutionist. I believed in billions of years, and believing in creationism is not a prerequisite for salvation. I was saved as just believing there was, if there was a God, he started things in motion and then basically stepped out of the picture, and he's unknowable. That's where I was when I came to faith in Jesus Christ. But cosmologists talk about the fact that there are 122 variables. So I just like to think of this as dials on a machine. So picture this 122 variables with a white line at the top of every single one of these dials. And all of these 122 variables, all of these desires have to be simultaneously set to 1 million millionths of top dead center for the universe to exist. 1 million millionths of top dead center, or the infant universe would have sprung into existence and it would have immediately collapsed back in on itself. Notice a quote. Stephen Hawking, I referenced him already a moment ago, but Stephen Hawking said this: if the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million millionths, that's infinitesimally small, the universe would have recollapsed before it ever reached its present size into a hot fireball. The odds against a universe like ours emerging out of something like the Big Bang are enormous. I think there are religious implications. He said this when he was a younger man. As he grew older, and now he's passed away, as he grew older, he became more hardened to even the idea of a God and made it his mission to explain creation apart from any divine intervention whatsoever. And in his best attempt to do that, he attributed the handiwork of God to gravity. Here he's referencing just one of those 122 variables that needed to be set to 1 million millionths of top dead center for the universe to exist. It's been estimated that the odds of all 122 variables lining up at exactly the single moment in time stand at 1 times 10 to the 138th power. Mathematicians would say that anything greater than 1 times 10 to the 50th is an impossibility. It cannot happen. 1 times 10 to the 138th power. Here's my point in this. The laws of physics represented in those 122 variables had to pre-exist the creation of the universe for the universe to exist. So these 122 universal laws, they didn't spring up in the Big Bang. They existed prior to the Big Bang, if you want to call it that, or it would never have happened. So the question becomes, who set the dials? And Stephen Hawking would say, gravity. Again, that doesn't pass the logic test because gravity is one of those 122 variables. And so who created gravity? The answer to that question, loved ones, is God did. Gravity is his idea. The color blue is his idea. C# is his idea. The humpback whale, his idea. The fact that we're breathing air right now, his idea. Well, the third big bucket I want to walk through very quickly again with us is this idea of biology. There's a principle in biology known as irreducible complexity. If you're talking to someone who believes in biological evolution, they will be willing to fight you tooth and nail over this concept of irreducible complexity. Because if irreducible complexity is real, and I hope to convince you at some level that it is, then the entire biological evolutionary concept completely falls apart. But irreducible complexity argues this, that it says this, refers to a system or structure that is complex in very specific ways where every piece of the system has to be present in the right way before it's functional. Again, I'll say that again in case you're taking notes. Irreducible complexity refers to a system or structure that is complex in a very specific way where every piece of the system has to be present in the right way before it's functional, meaning it could not have come into existence a piece at a time. In order for it to do what it does, it all had to develop simultaneously. Let me give you 3 examples, and again, these 3 examples are just 3 among many. Oop, went too far. You can look at a website or an organization like Answers in Genesis. They'll give you, you could find hundreds of examples of irreducible complexity. I've picked 3 for the sake of our time together. The first picture at the end is the bombardier beetle, a very famous example because the bombardier beetle defends itself by shooting out 2 different chemicals out of sacs that it holds in its abdomen, and they mix together in the air behind the bombardier beetle in such a way that they form a noxious gas that burns at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Now imagine the complexities involved in that. First of all, one gas without the other does nothing, right? And then if these 2 different gases were to develop inside the bombardier beetle's abdomen, not separated from each other, the bombardier beetle kind of explodes spontaneously, right? He's kind of one and done at that point if he doesn't have 2 sacs to hold these chemicals in separation from one another. Then he has to develop the tubes that allow him to expel these 2 gases, and these tubes have to be shaped in such a way that these gases actually come out of his abdomen arcing toward one another so that they actually mix at the right distance away from it so that it doesn't get negatively affected by this 200 degree Fahrenheit blast that comes out of its abdomen. If any one of these mechanisms is not present, the bombardier beetle is one and done. So again, just think about the odds of something this complex evolving piecemeal over time. What would have been the factors that would have driven that? Because the first time it doesn't work, that genetic line gets cut off. It doesn't get a chance to reproduce itself, so that maybe evolution might take it a step further in the next generation and the next generation and the next generation. It's just squished or eaten. And that mutation comes to an end if that's the worldview you're buying into. The second example I have on the screen is that of a giraffe. A giraffe can be as big as 18 feet tall or perhaps even more. It takes a lot of effort to get blood up to its brain, so the giraffe's heart is 2.5 feet long. This is a huge organ in the giraffe to be able to pump blood high enough, right, against the force of gravity to feed oxygen and other things to the giraffe's brain. Well, what happens when the giraffe bends over to get a drink? So we all talk about, evolutionists will talk about the fact that the giraffe had to evolve with this longer and longer neck to be able to reach leaves higher and higher on the tree. Okay, fine. We can go down that path and have that discussion, but what happens when this same giraffe wants to bend over and get a drink of water? If there aren't mechanisms in place to protect the giraffe biologically, like internally to itself, if there aren't measures in place to protect the giraffe from its own heart, when he bends over to get a drink, that 2.5 foot long heart is beating with such force that now, not against gravity, but in partnership with gravity, there would be so much blood that would go to its brain, it would have an aneurysm and die. And so what happens? When the giraffe bends over to get a drink of water, there are these little check valves in the artery that goes from the heart to the brain, and they begin to close off as the giraffe's head bends towards the water. And not only that, but the last bit of blood that is at the top of that artery as the giraffe bends over to get a drink of water gets stored in this spongy mass of tissue at the base of its brain. Because again, what happens if those check valves in that artery that are supplying blood to the brain are not there? The giraffe bends over to get a drink of water and he becomes lunch for the lions. Because his brain explodes and he's dead. Well, what happens if that spongy mass of tissue is not at the base of its brain holding some blood in reserve? Well, when the giraffe gets its drink and goes to stand back up, those check valves begin to open, but there is a moment in time where the blood is now catching back up. If that fleshy tissue there at the back, spongy tissue at the back of the brain isn't there and releasing that stored blood into the brain simultaneously, that blood is now moving back up that artery, the giraffe faints, literally faints, falls over, and becomes lunch for the lions. So again, think about the complexity required that all of these systems had to be in place simultaneously. Or listen, we don't have giraffes because the first animal with a mutation that might lead to giraffes but didn't have all of these things in place, right? He's one and done. The third example on the screen that I have for you, and again, these are I think, obvious examples, and you can find hundreds more, is that of the sea slug. The sea slug eats sea anemones. If you've ever watched Finding Nemo, you know what a sea anemone is because it's where Nemo and his dad live. Why do clownfish live inside of sea anemones? Because sea anemones have these stinging cells, on their tentacles that sting other fish and so on that are trying to eat it. So they make contact with the sea anemone, they get stung, they repel from that painful encounter, and they don't mess with the sea anemone. And God designed clownfish that they can actually live inside of those and they don't get adversely affected by the sea anemone. Well, the sea slug actually eats sea anemones. So how does that happen? Well, as the sea slug is eating the sea anemone, there are mechanisms within its stomach to consume it without being stung by its stinging cells. And there are actually these ciliated tubes connected to its stomach that transport those stinging cells through its body to sacs along its perimeter, along its edge that it uses to propel itself along the sea floor, that the sea slug then uses for its own defense against the creatures that would want to eat it. Now again, I would ask you, what kinds of things would have had to happen in order for that kind of complexity to develop spontaneously through random chance and mutation over time? If the first sea slug didn't have all of those mechanisms present at exactly the same time when he tried to eat the sea anemone, he would have been stung and died, one and done. Irreducible complexity is seen throughout creation. So listen, everybody understands this. Complexity cannot arise spontaneously. Even Charles Darwin, who is often thought of as the father of the modern biological evolutionary worldview, even Darwin acknowledged in his book, The Origin of Species, back in 1859, that if irreducible complexity could be proven to be true, his entire thesis would fall apart. It has been proven to be true. So again, when you start having these conversations with someone who is deeply entrenched in this worldview, they'll fight you tooth and nail over these things. Why? Because there are huge implications for them if it turns out that that's actually not true. A program has to have a programmer. A watch has to have a watchmaker. Therefore, Paul's conclusion of all of this is that we're without excuse for not acknowledging the fact that God is. And in our failure to acknowledge him and to glorify him as we were designed to do, we become, Paul says, futile in our thinking, literally empty. We become empty-headed and our foolish hearts are darkened. Again, that's part of God's passive wrath against humanity. And the Bible is actually honest enough to admit that there is a way that seems right to men. Listen, you get a bunch of human beings together in our natural state, we can agree on a lot of things. We can be like, well, that makes sense to me. Why don't we do it like this? That makes sense to me. But the writer of that proverb says this: there's a way that seems right to men. There's a way that makes sense to us, but the end thereof, he says, is death. It's death. Why does it make sense to us in our natural state? Because we don't think the way we're meant to think. Notice verse 22 and 23. Paul says this: claiming to be wise, they became fools. And they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. They choose to play the part of the fool. I brought up Stephen Hawking a number of times this morning, and you may think I'm picking on him. I'm not actually picking on him. I'm in some ways honoring him by using him as an illustration, because Stephen Hawking is universally recognized as being brilliant. And yet, for all of his brilliance, for all of his immense intelligence, he missed the most basic truth in the universe. There is a God. And was this by accident? No, loved ones, it was not. It came from a heart whose default position was, I will not have a God to rule over me. I will not give an account to anyone. I am my own highest authority. No one will define for me what is right and wrong for me other than me. And the result, Paul says, is this turning away from the Creator to the creation. And we've already said that creation cannot satisfy a heart that was made only to be satisfied by God himself. Ecclesiastes 3:11 says that God has put eternity in the heart of every man. There is a longing in all of us to connect with something that is over us, transcendent and above us. But in our darkened and futile minds, we turn from him, we turn from the pursuit of him, we turn from seeking him to creation itself that cannot satisfy us. And whenever you turn away from the Creator to creation, the only thing that we're left to pursue is pleasure. And this is right now where someone's thinking, that's awesome. That's what I want anyway. I just want to feel good. Here's the problem. When pleasure becomes your highest ambition, it always turns to pain. You think I'm lying? Come back next week. I want to end with this. It's very fashionable in our day and age to claim to be an atheist. It's a rather new experience in the breadth of humanity to claim that there is no God. Especially among our younger generations, a Gen Z person is 3 times more likely to say that they're an atheist or claim to self-identify as an atheist than any other person of any other generation. The fastest growing religious demographic in America are the nones, people with no religious affiliation whatsoever. But if that's you this morning, maybe you're in the room and you don't believe that there's a God and you would claim to your atheism and you're very pleased with yourself to claim to be an atheist. Listen, you got to recognize that the burden is on you to prove that there is no God. I don't have to prove to you that God exists. You have to prove that he doesn't. Why don't I have to prove that God exists? Because creation is full of evidence of his existence. You just don't want to look at it. So from the microscope to the telescope to the mirror you looked in when you got ready this morning, all of it shouts to you, there is a God, there is a God, there is a God. And the only way that you can claim to atheism is you have to hold all that down, suppress it in your unbelief, claim not to see it so that you can then say there is no God. Prove it. There's people will say, well, you can't prove that God exists. I think I can. I think I have. And here's the reality. The wrath of God grows against you with every second that you live in your unbelief. And here's what we all have to contend with. General revelation, that which can be known about God through creation, only gives us enough knowledge, only gives us enough knowledge to condemn us. It does not give us enough knowledge to save us. You can't get to the gospel. You can't get to the reality of God becoming man, born of a virgin, living a sinless life, dying in our place to pay our debt, rising triumphantly from the grave, sending his Spirit out into the world to draw unbelievers to himself, to save them and give them forgiveness and eternal life. You cannot get there by looking at the stars. You cannot get there by contemplating an acorn. You cannot get there by looking at creation. Creation will convince you that there is a God. That's enough to condemn you for your unbelief in him, but it cannot save you. For that, you need the second book. For that, you need this book. For that, you need the gospel. For that, you need Jesus. An illustration that I love to use is to ask you to imagine that you are standing at the base of the Hoover Dam. There's this great wall of concrete that's in front of you. And it's holding back an unfathomable weight of water. And what I want you to imagine is that water represents the wrath of God that is building up against you because of your unbelief. And with every second that you live in your unbelief, another drop is added to that water behind the dam. And it grows taller and taller and heavier and heavier. But that dam is there to hold back that water. It's there to hold back that wrath. But you find yourself standing at the bottom of the Hoover Dam and you're looking up at this mountain of concrete in front of you, and in a moment in time, that concrete breaks and all that water bursts forth upon you like a flood. And you see this great wall of water coming upon you, and you know that it's going to crush you. But just at the last second before you are utterly just, obliterated from the weight of this water and its fury pouring down upon you, a stranger comes out of nowhere, throws you to the ground, and he covers you with his own body. And as he's covering you with his own body, you hear the thunder of the water, but over that you hear his screams of agony. You feel his strong arms hold you secure, even though everything is shaking around you with the thunder of the fury of that water coming down upon you. And when the very last drop of that water lands on his back, he rolls off of you dead, but you're alive. Listen, that's the cross. That's what Jesus did for you and for me when he came in flesh to become that perfect sacrifice to pay our debt. So, listen, if you walk away from here thinking, well, I didn't used to believe in God, but now I think I do believe in God, you're still not where you need to be. Because it isn't about what you believe about God, it's what do you believe about Jesus? And what have you done with him? And by a simple act of your faith, love, I don't know who you are, but by just a simple movement of your heart, believing that Jesus is the one who came to pay your debt, and finally turning from your unbelief, turning from that constant lifestyle of rebellion where you raise yourself before him saying, I'm going to do what I want to do, even if it's just violating your own conscience and doing what you know you ought not to do. And say, I'm done running. I'm done trying to climb religious ladders. I'm done trying to do more and be good enough. I'm just giving my life to Jesus Christ. I'm just putting my faith in him and receiving him to be my Savior from my sin. The Bible says you will be saved. What did Paul say last week? It's the power of God unto salvation for all who believe. Therefore, he says, I'm not ashamed. What about you this morning who would call yourself a Christian? Can you go to work tomorrow? Can you go to school tomorrow and have this same conversation with the people who are far from God around you tomorrow? If you can't, that's a dereliction of duty. That's Christian incompetence. Again, it's not your job to save anyone, but it is your job to make sure they hear. It is your job to make sure they have an opportunity to believe. They can look around creation and they can learn as much about God as is necessary to condemn them in hell forever. But they cannot learn what they need to learn to find eternal life. They're meant to learn that from us. And if you don't feel like you're equipped, you need to get equipped. And maybe what you need to do, first off, is just go home and turn the live stream back on and watch it again and take some more notes. So that we can give people the opportunity that God intends for them to have to learn about this God of wonders who has made himself known and wants to be known by us. He wants to be known by us. Would you be a part of that process? Would you be a part of that great work?